Pick any wife for free, the judge's voice boomed, cracking like a whip across the dusty courthouse square. The whole town of San Miguel roared with laughter. It was a cruel sound, sharp and ugly, the kind of laughter that feeds on another's pain. He called it his wife raffle, a spectacle designed to shame men who couldn't pay their debts by forcing their daughters or sisters onto a public stage. A spectacle for a town that had forgotten what mercy felt like. Judge Horace Braddock, a man whose heart was as dry as the dirt under his polished boots, gestured to the line of women standing with their heads bowed. "Step right up, gentlemen," he crowed. "Clear your debts. Find a helpmate. A bargain at any price. Because there is no price." The crowd surged, a mix of dusty ranchers and smirking merchants, all thirsty for a bit of sport. And that's when they brought her forward. Abby Yodar, her plain black dress and white prayer cap, screamed, "Outsider!" An Amish woman, 1,000 miles from her home in Pennsylvania, now standing in a circle of wolves. The jeers started instantly. "Look at the size of her!" a man shouted. "She's built like a barn." "Might need 2 husbands for that one," another roared. The laughter was a physical thing, a wave of heat and hate that washed over Abby. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots. Her hands, clasped tight in front of her, moved in silent prayer. She'd faced mockery before, back home, when she'd defied her community's elders. Their cruelty had driven her west, but it hadn't broken her. Not yet. Judge Braddock soaked it all in, a grin splitting his face. "Come now," he taunted. "A fine Amish wife. Think of the pies, the quilts." He paused, letting the silence hang before delivering the punchline. "And all those, other domestic talents." The laughter turned fouler, uglier. Each word was a stone thrown at her spirit. But Abby stood straight. Her mama had taught her that. Stand straight, trust the Lord's plan. Then through the wall of noise, a figure stepped forward. The crowd quieted slowly in ragged waves as they realized this wasn't another heckler. This was Louis Boone. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who gentles spooked horses for a living. His shoulders were broad, his face lined with sun and sorrow, his eyes shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He was a man drowning in his own grief, his ranch teetering on the edge of ruin since his wife passed last winter. The silence was absolute now. The only sound was the wind kicking up dust devils in the square. Louis Boone stopped directly in front of Abby. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square like the toll of a church bell. "I'll take the obese Amish girl," he said. The laughter died in the dust. Every last snicker, every cruel chuckle vanished. No one had seen this coming. Not from Louis Boone, not in a town that lived on cruelty. Judge Braddock's smile faltered. "Now hold on, Mr. Boone. You sure about this? There are other options." "I'm sure," Louis said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of iron. He stepped closer to Abby. For the first time, she dared to look up. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers. There was no mockery in them, no pity, no cruel amusement. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Respect. He held out a hand, calloused from ranch work but surprisingly gentle. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat as if she were the finest lady in the territory. That simple gesture, that sliver of dignity in a sea of humiliation, brought tears to her eyes. But she blinked them back. She would not show weakness. Not here. She placed her hand in his. Judge Braddock, his cruel entertainment ruined, shuffled his papers. "Well then," he grumbled, "the lady's debts are cleared. She is your responsibility now." "Much obliged, Judge," Louis said, his tone perfectly polite, yet it held a steel edge that made the judge take a half step back. Without another word, Louis led Abby down the courthouse steps. The crowd parted for them, their earlier glee soured into shame. They walked out of that courthouse and into a storm neither of them saw coming, because what began as a cruel joke was about to become a fight for their very lives. This wasn't a rescue. It was something else entirely. As they reached his wagon, the judge turned to his clerk and muttered, just loud enough for the wind to catch the words. "He has no idea what he's done," the judge whispered, a strange, cold smile returning to his face. Boone just signed his own death warrant. The wagon wheels groaned a steady rhythm, kicking up fine clouds of dust that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. San Miguel and its jeering crowds faded behind them, the sound swallowed by the vast, empty landscape. Abby sat straight on the worn wooden seat, her hands folded primly in her lap. She stole glances at the man beside her. Louis Boone kept his eyes on the road, handling the reins with a practiced ease that spoke of a lifetime spent with horses. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't threatening either. It was a waiting silence, heavy with questions neither of them knew how to ask. To the west, mountains clawed at the sky, their peaks brushed with the sun's dying gold. Abby had never seen anything like them. They made her feel small, but not in the crushing way the crowd had. This was the smallness of standing before God's own creation, a humbling that lifted the soul. A cool breeze whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. For the first time all day, Abby drew a full breath. She was free. Whatever came next, she was no longer in that circle of hate. Louis cleared his throat. "My ranch is about 10 miles out," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not much, but the land is good. Clean water year-round." "Thank you," Abby whispered. She gathered her courage. "Not just for the information, Mr. Boone. For what you did back there." He gave a slight nod, his eyes still on the trail. "Louise," he said after a moment. "My name is Louise." "I'm Abby," she replied. "Abby Yodar." The wagon rolled on, the sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars pricked the darkness. Abby remembered her mother telling her that stars were God's promise, that light always returns. Today had brought so much darkness. But it had also brought Luis. He pointed with his chin toward a faint flickering glow on the horizon, miles to the south. "That's them," he said, his voice tight. "The railroad." Abby looked. The distant light seemed like a scar on the perfect dark of the prairie. "They're the reason this whole valley is on edge," he continued. "They've got the politicians in their pockets. The law, too. They take what they want. Land, water. They're like a fever burning through the territory." He fell silent, but the tension coming off him was a palpable thing. He wasn't just a grieving rancher. He was a man living on a battlefield. They finally crested a rise, and his ranch lay below them in a shallow valley. The house was a dark shape against the starlight, a solid log structure. But even in the gloom, Abby could see the neglect. The sagging porch, the broken corral fence, the silence. It was a place heavy with loss. Louise helped her down from the wagon. "The house. It's gone to ruin since Sarah passed," he said, the name of his late wife hanging in the air between them. "Fever took her last winter. Took her fast." He led her inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and disuse. He lit a lamp, revealing a main room that was clean but deeply neglected. Dust lay like a shroud on every surface. "Guest rooms this way," he said, leading her to a small, simple room. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out into the vast darkness. "It's yours. There's a lock on the door, if you want it." His consideration touched her. "Thank you," she said. After a simple, silent supper of beans and stale bread, Abby retired to her room. She knelt beside the bed, the familiar words of her evening prayers a comfort in this strange new place. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, wild sound that echoed the ache in her own heart. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle. It was an old house, full of creaks and groans. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the day, the mockery, the fear, Luis's quiet act of defiance. Sometime after midnight, another sound drifted through her window, a rhythmic scraping. Thump, scrape, thump. Curiosity warred with fear. She crept to the window, peering through the dusty glass. The moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light over the yard. And there was Luis. He was behind the barn, half hidden in the shadows. He had a shovel in his hands. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't fixing a fence. He was digging. She watched, her heart pounding, as he dug a small, deep hole. Then he retrieved something from the shadows of the barn. A small metal box, dark and heavy. He placed it carefully in the hole, then quickly filled it in, tamping the earth down with his boots. He scattered some loose hay over the spot, and then he was gone, melting back into the darkness of the house. Abby backed away from the window, her mind racing. What had she just seen? What was in that box? What kind of secrets was this quiet, grieving man bearing in the dead of night? She had traded one prison for another, and she was beginning to realize that the mockery of the crowd in San Miguel was nothing compared to the terrifying secrets hidden in the shadows of this silent ranch. Dawn broke, painting the kitchen in pale gray light. Abby was already up. Her body, trained by years of Amish discipline, knew no other way. She moved through the neglected kitchen, her hands finding work to do. She found coffee beans and ground them, the familiar motion a small comfort. She coaxed the old wood stove to life, and soon the kitchen filled with the first welcoming aroma it had known in months. As she worked, she took stock. Grease-spotted walls, dusty shelves, a pantry in disarray. The house was sturdy, but its heart was broken. Luis's bootsteps on the porch made her freeze. He entered, then stopped short, staring at her as if she were an apparition. "Good morning," she said quietly, gesturing to the coffee pot. "I hope you don't mind." "Mind?" He shook his head, taking off his hat. He accepted the cup she offered, his eyes scanning the room, noticing the small changes she'd already made. A clean countertop, a neatly swept floor. "Been a while," he murmured, more to himself than to her. They ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush in silence. The questions from the night before screamed in Abby's mind, but she pushed them down. What was in the box? Why did you bury it? After they finished, Louis cleared his throat. "I've got chores. You, do what you need to." He escaped to the barn, leaving her alone in the quiet house. Abby rolled up her sleeves. Work was her prayer, her sanctuary. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing away a winter's worth of grime and neglect. She found soap and rags, and with a fierce determination, she brought the room back to life. She found flour and yeast and started a batch of bread, the rhythm of kneading the dough as familiar and comforting as breathing. By midday, the kitchen was transformed. The windows gleamed, the shelves were organized, and the smell of baking bread filled the entire house. Just as she was taking the golden brown loaves from the oven, she heard a horse approaching at a frantic gallop. A man reined in sharply in the yard, his face pale with panic. It was a neighbor, his clothes covered in dust, his eyes wide with fear. Luis came running from the barn. "Thompson, what is it?" "It's the railroad, Luis," the man gasped, leaning from his saddle. "They did it. They diverted the creek. My place is already dry. My cattle." He choked on the words. "They'll be dead in a week." Abby felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This was what Luis had warned her about. The fever burning through the territory. "How?" Luis demanded. "They can't just—" "They have papers," Thompson cried, his voice cracking. "Legal papers, all signed and official. Signed by Judge Braddock himself." He looked at Luis, his eyes full of a terrible dawning horror. "And Luis, they're saying you're next. They're saying they have a paper for your land too." Luis's face went rigid. "That's a lie." Thompson shook his head, his whole body trembling. "It's not just any paper, Luis. They're telling everyone in town. They say your wife, Sarah, she signed a deal with them right before she died." The world seemed to stop. The neighbor's words hung in the air, venomous and unthinkable. "Sarah? Betray him?" Luis stared at Thompson, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. "No," he whispered, "she wouldn't." But the seed of doubt, planted by a desperate man, had taken root. Abby watched the fragile trust they had started to build shatter into a million pieces. The look on Luis's face was terrifying. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. And it was directed not just at the railroad, or the judge, or the memory of his wife. It was directed at her. He turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The warmth she had seen in the courthouse was gone, replaced by icy suspicion. "What do you know about this?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Is this why you came west? Were you sent here?" The accusation was a slap in the face. She felt the blood drain from her cheeks. The smell of fresh bread, once a symbol of hope and home, now seemed to mock her. She was an outsider again, a stranger under his roof, and suddenly a suspect. The secrets buried in the dark were beginning to surface, and they were far uglier than she could have ever imagined. "No," Abby said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm. "I know nothing of this." Louis stared at her, his eyes searching for a lie, for the flicker of deceit he now expected to find everywhere. The air in the kitchen was thick with suspicion, so heavy she could barely breathe. Thompson, seeing the storm he had unleashed, mumbled an apology and rode away, leaving them in the wreckage of his news. Before the silence could break them, another sound reached them, the slow, tired plod of a pony. A boy rode into the yard. He couldn't have been more than 15, with dark hair and his uncle's dignified features, but his heritage was clearly mixed. He sat on the rangy pinto with a weariness that didn't belong on shoulders so young. Luis's expression hardened. "Henry," he said, the name a flat, toneless statement. The boy, Henry, slid from the pony's back. His eyes darted from his uncle to Abby, then back again, assessing the tension. "Uncle Luis," he said quietly. He looked down at his worn boots, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. "They won't have me at the school anymore," he said, his voice steady but laced with pain. "The other boys, their parents, they said I don't belong." He looked up, and the hurt in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "Got nowhere else to go." Abby's heart went out to him. Another outcast, another soul rejected by the cruelties of this world. But Luis was a man adrift in his own sea of betrayal and anger. He looked at his nephew, and Abby could see him about to close the door, to shut out one more complication he couldn't handle. "You can't stay here," Luis started, his voice rough. "He can and he will," Abby said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them both. She stepped forward, past Luis, her focus entirely on the boy. "You must be cold and hungry," she said warmly, her tone a stark contrast to the icy atmosphere. "Come in where it's dry. I'll fix you something to eat." Henry looked at his uncle, who stood stunned into silence by Abby's defiance. After a long moment, Luis gave a short, jerky nod. Abby led the boy into the kitchen. The warmth and the smell of bread seemed to surprise him. She pulled out a chair, set a plate in front of him, and piled it high with fresh bread and the last of the morning's stew. He ate with a quiet dignity, his manners impeccable despite his obvious hunger. Luis leaned against the doorframe, watching them, his face unreadable. He was a stranger in his own home, his authority challenged, his world spinning out of control. The arrival of his nephew, instead of being a comfort, had just driven another wedge between him and Abby. He saw them, two outcasts finding solace in each other, and it only fueled the fire of his suspicion. That night the house was colder than ever. They ate supper in a silence so profound, it felt like a physical weight. Luis retreated into himself, his grief now twisted with anger and doubt. Henry, sensing the chasm between the adults, was quiet and watchful. Abby felt utterly alone, trapped between a man who thought she was a spy and a boy who looked at her with desperate hope. Later, unable to sleep, Abby stared out her window at the moonlit yard. The spot where Luis had buried the box seemed to mock her. The secrets of this place were a poison, and she was caught in the middle of it. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. She held her breath. It was Henry creeping silently through the house. He stopped outside her door. He thought she was asleep. She watched his shadow under the door as he slipped past and went outside. Where was he going? She waited a few minutes, then followed, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. From the kitchen window she saw him. He wasn't running away. He was crouched in the shadows near the barn, watching the same spot she had watched the night before. He was watching the spot where Luis buried the box. Then she saw another shadow detach itself from the house. It was Luis. He was moving toward the barn, a shovel in his hand again. Henry saw him too. The boy flattened himself against the barn wall, hiding in the deepest part of the shadows. What was happening? Was Luis going to dig up the box? Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a strange protective urge, not just for herself, but for the boy hiding in the dark. She had to know what was going on. She slipped out the back door, moving like a ghost through the darkness, her goal the same as Henry's. The shadows by the barn. She reached the barn just as Louis did. He didn't see them. He was lost in his own world, his face a mask of grim determination in the moonlight. He started to dig. Suddenly, a twig snapped under Henry's foot. Louis froze. He spun around, his eyes wild, the shovel held like a weapon. "Who's there?" he hissed. He saw Henry first. The boy stood frozen, caught in the moonlight. Louis's face contorted with rage. "Spying on me?" Then his eyes shifted, and he saw Abby stepping out from behind the corner of the barn. His expression curdled into one of utter betrayal. "You?" he breathed, the word full of venom. "You put him up to this. The two of you. Spying on me." He took a step toward them, his knuckles white on the handle of the shovel. For a terrifying second, Abby thought he might strike them. The quiet, respectable rancher from the courthouse was gone. In his place was a cornered animal, raw with pain and ready to lash out at anyone. "What's in the box, Uncle Luis?" Henry asked, his voice shaking but brave. "You stay out of this." Luis roared. "We deserve to know," Abby said, finding her voice. "You accuse me of being a spy. You treat this boy like a burden. You hide your secrets in the ground. If you want trust, you have to give it." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, the rage in his eyes warring with a profound agony. He looked from Abby's defiant face to Henry's frightened one, and something inside him seemed to break. The shovel fell from his hands. "You want to know?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You really want to know what's in the box?" He fell to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, clawing at the dirt like a madman. He pulled the small metal box from the earth and fumbled with the latch. "Sarah didn't betray me," he choked out, wrenching the lid open. "She was murdered." He turned the box over. Nothing fell out. He reached inside and pulled out two things. The first was a folded piece of paper. The second was a small corked glass vial containing a murky dark liquid. "The railroad's doctor, the same one who works for Judge Braddock. He said it was a fever," Louis said, his voice hollow. "But I knew something was wrong." He unfolded the paper. "I rode to another county, paid a doctor there to test a sample of her blood I'd saved. This is his report." Abby took the paper. Her eyes scanned the scientific terms until they landed on a single, horrifying word. "Arsenic." "The tonic," Louis whispered, holding up the vial. "They told her it was a tonic for her nerves. She refused to sign their papers, so they killed her. They murdered my wife." The pieces clicked into place with dizzying, sickening speed. The forged signature. Judge Braddock's involvement, the railroad's ruthlessness, and the wife raffle. It wasn't just a cruel spectacle. It was a trap. It was designed to force a spy into his house, or to shame him so badly he'd sell his land and leave. His whole life was a carefully constructed plot designed to destroy him. "I chose you," Louis said, looking at Abby, his eyes full of a terrible, haunting clarity. "Out of all of them, I chose you, because you were an outsider. You were the only one in that whole damn town I knew couldn't possibly be one of them." His desperate act of self-preservation had saved her from the mob, but it had also thrown her directly into the path of a group of cold-blooded killers. He hadn't rescued her. He had made her a target. The revelation hung in the cold night air, as stark and chilling as the moonlight. Sarah wasn't a traitor. She was a victim, and they were standing on the land she was murdered for. "We have to tell the sheriff," Abby said, her mind reeling. Louis let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "The sheriff? He's on the railroad's payroll, same as the judge. They own this town, top to bottom. There's no one to tell. No one who will help." He looked down at the vial of poison in his hand, then back at the house. "They wanted a spy in my house. When that failed, they thought I'd be broken by grief. But now—" He looked from Abby to Henry. "Now I have a family, something to fight for. And that makes us more dangerous to them than ever." A new kind of fear settled over Abby. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about survival. Clayton Reeves, the railroad man, Judge Braddock, they weren't just greedy, they were murderers. And now they knew Luis knew. "They won't stop," Henry said, his voice small but steady. "They'll come for the ranch. For us." "Then we need more proof," Abby said. a new resolve hardening her voice. The shock was giving way to a cold, clear anger. They had taken this man's wife, and now they were trying to take everything else. Proof they can't bury or deny. Your wife, Sarah. Did she keep records? A journal? Luis looked up, a flicker of something in his eyes. The barn loft, he whispered. She kept everything up there. Years of it. They left the open grave and the terrible secrets behind and went to the barn. The loft was thick with the dust of years, smelling of old hay and forgotten memories. By the light of a single lantern, they began their search. It was a treasure trove of a life lived. Old trunks filled with faded letters, leather-bound ledgers documenting every calf born and every fence mended. They worked for hours, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the soft hoot of an owl outside. Henry, with his sharp young eyes, sorted documents by date, while Abby, with her methodical mind, looked for anything out of place. Luis moved like a man in a dream, touching his late wife's belongings with a reverent sadness. He was seeing her last days in a new, horrific light. Here, Abby said suddenly, her voice tight. She pulled a small, cloth-bound book from the bottom of a trunk filled with baby clothes. It wasn't a ledger. It was a diary. Sarah's diary. Luis took it, his hands trembling. He opened it to the last few pages. The handwriting, once so neat and flowing, grew shaky, erratic. He began to read aloud, his voice cracking. October 12th. Mr. Reeves from the railroad visited today while Luis was in town. He was polite, but his eyes were cold. He spoke of progress, of the good the railroad will do. But when I told him we would never sell, his smile disappeared. He said it would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen. He turned the page. October 19th. They are trying to steal our water. Luis is furious, but I'm afraid. Reeves was here again. He said there are ways to make stubborn people see reason. He said Luis should be careful. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air in the loft grew cold, heavy. Luis's breath hitched. He pointed to the final entry, dated the day before she took to her bed for the last time. November 3rd. I feel unwell. A strange weakness. Mr. Reeves came to the house this morning. He was not alone. He brought Judge Braddock with him. They said they heard I was feeling poorly. They brought a tonic for my nerves. The judge himself poured the first dose. I fear. The sentence was never finished. There it was. The proof. A voice from the grave, naming her killers. The judge. The railroad man. They hadn't just threatened her. They had delivered the poison themselves. A floorboard creaked below them. They all froze. The lantern cast their terrified, wide-eyed faces in sharp relief. Someone was in the barn. Luis silently blew out the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. He grabbed an old pitchfork, his knuckles white. Abby held her breath, her heart hammering so loud she was sure they could hear it downstairs. Henry pressed himself into the corner, making himself small. Heavy bootsteps echoed on the packed earth floor below. More than one person. You sure he's up here? A rough voice growled. Reeves said to check, another voice answered. Said Boone's been asking questions, stirring up trouble. Wants us to remind him to mind his own business. The voices were directly below them now. Abby could hear the jingle of spurs. A beam of light from a lantern cut through the darkness downstairs, playing across the stalls. The men were searching. For Luis. For them. They were trapped in the dark, with the murderer's henchmen just feet below and the proof of their crime clutched in their hands. The diary suddenly felt like it was burning a hole right through the leather cover. One of the men stopped at the bottom of the loft ladder. He looked up into the suffocating darkness where they were hiding. Anyone up there? He called out, his voice echoing in the silent barn. No one breathed. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then the man placed his boot on the first rung of the ladder. He was coming up. The creak of the ladder rung was the loudest sound Abby had ever heard. One step, then another. He was coming, slowly, deliberately, climbing into their hiding place. Luis stood motionless, the pitchfork held tight, its tines glinting faintly in the sliver of moonlight, coming through a crack in the roof. Abby clutched Sarah's diary to her chest, praying with a fervor she hadn't felt since the day of the raffle. The man's head and shoulders appeared in the opening of the loft. The lantern he held cast his face in a grotesque, shifting light. He swept the beam across the dusty space. It passed over a stack of old barrels, then across a pile of hay. Any second now, the light would find them. Suddenly, Henry moved. With a speed and silence that was startling, he grabbed a small, empty grain sack. In one fluid motion, he hurled it into the far corner of the loft. It landed with a soft, scurrying sound, like a rat disturbed from its nest. The man on the ladder flinched, whipping the lantern beam toward the noise. "What was that?" "Just a damn rat," his partner called up from below. "Hurry up. This place gives me the creeps." The man hesitated, his light still fixed on the corner. He took one more step up, peering into the darkness. Then, seemingly satisfied, he grunted and started back down the ladder. "Nothing up here," he called. "Let's check the house." They listened, hearts pounding, as the men's footsteps retreated from the barn. The heavy doors scraped shut. They were gone, for now. They waited in the suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity before Luis dared to relight their own lantern. The small flame seemed impossibly bright, a beacon of defiance in the terrifying night. "He saved us," Luis whispered, looking at Henry with a new kind of respect. The boy just nodded, his face pale but his eyes steady. "They'll be back," Abby said, her voice shaking. "We have the diary. They know we're a threat." "We can't go to the law," Luis said, thinking aloud, "and we can't fight them head on. They have guns in numbers." It was then that Henry spoke, his voice clear and sure in the quiet loft. "There is another law," he said, "an older one. My mother's people, the Apache, they have records, treaties. They know the true boundaries of this land, from before the railroad, before the town." Luis and Abby stared at him. "Elder Chano," Henry continued, "he is my mother's kinsman. He is the keeper of the stories. He knows the promises the government in Washington made. The railroad can't break those promises without a fight, a real fight, in a real court." He looked at his uncle, his gaze direct. "He would listen to me. He would tell me the truth." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, relying on old treaties and the word of an Apache elder against the power and money of the railroad seemed like folly. "They won't listen to an Indian," Louis said, the harsh reality of their world coloring his tone. "They'll listen to the law," Abby insisted, her hope rekindling. "If those treaties are valid, they supersede anything Judge Braddock has signed. It's our only chance." She looked at Luis, her eyes pleading. "We have to trust him." Luis looked at his nephew, at the quiet strength in the boy's face. He saw not just a boy, but a bridge between two worlds, the son of his sister and an Apache warrior. A boy who belonged to both and to neither. And in that moment, he realized Henry's mixed heritage wasn't a mark of shame, as the town believed. It was their greatest weapon. "How long?" Luis asked. "To ride there and back?" "I can leave at first light," Henry said, his voice ringing with purpose. "I'll be back by sunset tomorrow." Luis nodded slowly. "Take the bay mare. She's the fastest and the most sure-footed." He placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Ride carefully." The rest of the night passed in a blur of tense preparation. They moved the diary and the most important ledgers to the house, hiding them beneath a loose floorboard in Abby's room. As dawn approached, a new threat emerged. A reddish glow began to stain the sky to the south. It wasn't the sunrise. "Fire," Louis said, his voice grim, as they stood on the porch. "They're at Thompson's ranch, the one who warned me." It was a message, clear and brutal. "This is what happens when you defy us." They watched the orange flames lick at the horizon, a funeral pyre for a man's dream. They knew their own home could be next. Just as the sun began to rise, Clayton Reeves, the railroad man, rode into their yard, flanked by two armed men. He didn't dismount. He sat on his fine black horse, looking down at them with a smug, predatory smile. "Morning, Boone," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Terrible business about the Thompson place. A real tragedy." He let his eyes drift over to the barn, then back to Luis. "Accidents happen out here. A stray spark. A faulty lamp." His eyes were cold, dead things. A man with a new family should be especially careful. It would be a shame to lose it all. The threat was unmistakable. He knew they were hiding something. He was daring them to make a move. Luis stood his ground, his hand resting on the porch rail, inches from the axe he kept there for splitting kindling. Abby stood beside him, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a serene mask that betrayed none of the terror she felt. Henry was already gone, a small, determined figure riding west, carrying all their hopes with him. Reeves's smile widened. "You have a good day now," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving the scent of menace lingering in the air like smoke. They were alone, marked for destruction, with only a boy on a fast horse and a handful of old papers standing between them and the fire. The waiting had begun, and it was going to be the longest day of their lives. The day crawled by, each hour stretching into an eternity. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching riders. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Luis worked with a grim, restless energy, patrolling the ranch boundaries, his rifle never far from his hand. Abby tried to keep busy in the house, but her prayers were constant, a silent mantra for Henry's safety. They didn't speak of their fear, but it was a living presence in the house with them. They knew Reeves's visit wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The railroad men were just waiting for the right moment, for the dead of night to make their move. As the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, their anxiety reached a fever pitch. Henry should be on his way back. Every minute that passed felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin. "He should be here," Luis said for the 10th time, pacing the length of the porch, his eyes fixed on the ridgeline. "The trail is difficult," Abby said, trying to soothe him, though her own heart was a knot of fear. "He is a good rider. God is watching over him." The sky bled from orange to purple. Dusk began to settle, blurring the edges of the world, and still there was no sign of Henry. Luis's shoulders slumped. "I shouldn't have sent him," he whispered, the words raw with guilt and fear. "He's just a boy." Just then, a sound, the unmistakable clatter of a horse's hooves on rock, coming from the trail. They both ran to the edge of the yard, straining to see through the gathering gloom. Two figures emerged from the twilight. Not one, two. Henry rode in first, his face tired but triumphant. Behind him, on a sturdy buckskin pony, rode an older man. He was tall and straight, his long, silver-streaked hair tied back with a leather band. His face was a roadmap of seasons and wisdom, and his eyes, dark and sharp, seemed to see right through to a person's soul. It was Elder Chano. "He has seen the papers," Henry announced as he slid from the saddle. "He says the treaties are strong." The elder dismounted with a grace that defied his years. He looked from Luis to Abby, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "The boy speaks of a great injustice," Chano said, his voice deep and resonant, like the river stones. "He speaks of promises broken by men who write their laws on paper, but not on their hearts." They led him inside. Abby quickly set another place at the table, her hands shaking with relief. She brought out the precious diary and the old ledgers, spreading them out under the lamplight. Elder Chano studied the documents, his weathered fingers tracing the faded ink of the treaties. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I remember when my father's father spoke of these words. The Singing Waters, what you call Crystal Creek, was promised to the families who chose to live between our worlds. Your wife's people." He looked at Luis. "The treaty protects this water. The railroad's claim is a lie." Joy, pure and overwhelming, bloomed in Abby's chest. She grabbed Luis's hand, and his fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. But that wasn't all. Luis, emboldened, brought out the small metal box. He showed the elder the vial of dark liquid. "They said it was a tonic," he said, his voice thick with renewed grief. "They used this to murder my wife." Elder Chano took the vial, holding it up to the light. He uncorked it and sniffed it carefully. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. His eyes hardened. "This is not a white man's poison," he said, his voice dropping low. "This is Twizi yildisti, snake root. It grows only in one hidden canyon, 2 days' ride from here." He looked directly at Luis, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Our healers use it, a single drop at a time, to slow a racing heart. But in a large dose, it brings on a terrible fever before it stops the heart for good. A chilling silence fell over the kitchen. There is only one man who knows where to find this root, Chano continued, his voice like the chipping of flint. A man who was cast out from our people years ago for his greed. He sells his knowledge to any who will pay. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He is known to do business with the men of the railroad, and he is Judge Braddock's cousin. The web was complete. The motive, the murder weapon, the proof, and now the poisoner himself, linked directly to the judge. They had them. They had everything. The railroad has called for a hearing, Louis said. In 3 days. They think they will crush us. Then in 3 days we will bring the truth. Elder Chano said. He placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. This boy who walks in 2 worlds has shown us the path. Now, we must walk it together. Later that night, after Elder Chano had departed with a promise to gather other elders who remembered the treaties, the 3 of them sat in the quiet kitchen. The evidence was piled on the table, a testament to their impossible victory. Henry, exhausted but glowing with pride, finally went up to bed. Louis turned to Abby in the warm lamplight. The grief and suspicion that had haunted his eyes were gone, replaced by an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. You did this, he said, his voice rough with feeling. When I was lost in anger, you kept your faith. When I saw only defeat, you saw hope. He crossed the room and took her hands in his. They were rough from work, but his touch was gentle. You brought this house back to life. You brought me back to life. He swallowed, his throat working. I didn't know how dark my world had become until you brought your light into it, Abby. He loved her. The word wasn't spoken, but it was there, shining in his eyes, clear and undeniable. And in that moment, Abby knew her own heart. The respect she'd felt, the compassion, the fierce desire to protect him and his home, it had all been weaving itself into the beautiful, sturdy fabric of love. From the top of the stairs, hidden in the shadows, Henry watched them. A slow grin spread across his face. This was it, the feeling he'd been searching for his whole life. Not just a roof over his head, but a home. Not just people who tolerated him, but a family, a real one. The hearing was in 3 days. The fight of their lives was coming. But for the first time, they weren't just fighting for land or for justice. They were fighting for each other, and that made them invincible. The 2 days leading up to the hearing were a whirlwind of preparation. They worked under the warm glow of the kitchen lamp late into the night, piecing together their case. Abby's neat, precise handwriting filled page after page with notes, creating a clear, undeniable timeline of the railroad's crimes. She organized the treaties, the land grants, Sarah's diary, and the doctor's report on the poison into a powerful arsenal of truth. Luis, meanwhile, practiced his testimony. He rehearsed the story of the land, of his wife's murder, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each telling. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a man ready to fight for his family's legacy. Henry served as their researcher, his sharp memory for his mother's stories and Elder Chano's teachings proving invaluable. He was the living link between the written law and the ancient law of the land. The morning of the hearing, they rode to San Miguel, not as 3 broken individuals, but as a united family. Abby wore her best black dress, a symbol not of submission, but of her unshakable faith. Luis wore the suit he'd married her in, his shoulders squared with resolve. Henry rode between them, his posture proud, carrying the precious documents in a carefully wrapped oilskin pouch. The town was buzzing. The courthouse was packed to the rafters. Ranchers and merchants, men who had jeered at Abby just weeks ago, now watched their arrival with a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect. Word of their stand had spread. Clayton Reeves, the railroad lawyer, sat at the front, looking smug and confident. Judge Braddock swept in, his black robes billowing, his face a mask of judicial impartiality that fooled no one. The hearing began. The railroad presented its case first, a slick and polished collection of half-truths and forged documents. Reeves painted Luis as a stubborn, backward-thinking rancher standing in the way of glorious progress. He even produced the forged document with Sarah's signature, calling her a sensible woman who understood the future, unlike her husband. The lie was so audacious it made Abby's blood run cold. Then it was their turn. Luis stood, his voice calm and steady. He didn't speak of progress or profits. He spoke of family, of a promise made to his wife's ancestors to care for the land. He told the court how the railroad had tried to steal his water, how they had harassed his family. Judge Braddock listened with a dismissive air. These are serious accusations, Mr. Boone. But they are just that, accusations. Do you have proof? We do, Your Honor, Luis said. My wife will present it. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Abby as she stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. She could feel Reeves's sneer, the judge's mocking gaze. But she wasn't the same woman who had trembled in the town square. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. The railroad claims this land based on documents that are both illegal and immoral. I will start with the law. She laid out the treaties one by one. She explained in simple, direct terms how they guarantee the water rights of the original settlers. She pointed out that any transfer of these rights required federal approval, which the railroad had never obtained. The room began to buzz. The ranchers in the crowd were leaning forward now, listening intently. This is nonsense, Reeves sputtered, jumping to his feet. Ancient history. It is the law of the land, Abby countered, her voice ringing with authority. A law you chose to ignore. But your crimes go far beyond illegal paperwork. And then she opened Sarah's diary. You claim Sarah Boone supported your railroad, she said, her eyes locking onto Reeves's. But her own words tell a different story. She began to read. She read about the threats, the intimidation. The courtroom was utterly silent, hanging on every word. Then she read the final, damning entry. Mr. Reeves came to the house this morning. He was not alone. He brought Judge Braddock with him. They brought a tonic for my nerves. The judge himself poured the first dose. A collective gasp swept the room. People turned to stare at the judge, whose face had gone a ghastly pale white. Reeves looked like he'd been punched in the gut. A lie, the judge thundered, banging his gavel. Slander from a dead woman. Is it? A deep voice called from the back of the room. The crowd parted as Elder Chano walked forward, his presence commanding immediate respect. He stopped before the judge's bench. I am Chano of the Apache, he said. The woman speaks the truth of the treaties, and I have more truth to share. He held up a small vial, identical to the one Luis had found. This is snake root. Its poison mimics a fever, and the only man who sells it is your cousin, Your Honor. The courtroom exploded. Shouts of murderer and liar echoed off the walls. The ranchers, realizing they had been cheated and manipulated, surged to their feet. Judge Braddock, cornered and exposed, began to stammer, his eyes darting around for an escape. The sheriff, a man who always sided with the powerful, looked at the furious crowd, at the damning evidence, and made a swift political calculation. He wasn't going down for this. With a look of grim resolution, he walked over to the judge's bench. Horace Braddock, the sheriff said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Boone. He then turned to the stunned Clayton Reeves. You too, for conspiracy to commit murder. Justice, swift and unexpected, had finally come to San Miguel. As the sheriff led the disgraced judge and the railroad lawyer away, the crowd swarmed around Luis, Abby, and Henry. Hands that had once pointed in mockery now reached out to clap them on the back. Voices that had jeered now offered apologies and congratulations. They had fought not just for their ranch, but for the soul of the entire valley. And they had won. They rode home in the golden light of the setting sun. The land, their land, seemed to welcome them back. That night, the ranch house, which had once been a place of grief and secrets, was filled with the sounds of a family celebrating. As Abby stood on the porch, looking out at the peaceful valley under a blanket of stars, Luis came to stand beside her. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. That day at the courthouse, he said softly, his voice full of wonder, I thought I was saving you. He turned her to face him, his eyes full of a love so deep it made her heart ache with joy. But the truth is, Abby, You were the one who saved me." She leaned into him, her head resting on his chest, finally truly home. The journey had been born from cruelty and despair, but through faith, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of a chosen family, it had ended in love and redemption. The quiet Amish woman and the grieving rancher, two outcasts brought together by a cruel twist of fate, had found in each other not just a safe harbor, but a love that would last a lifetime. The story of their victory spread like wildfire, a tale of courage that rekindled the spirit of the valley. The railroad, its corruption exposed, packed up its crooked surveyors and retreated, its power broken. The land healed, the creeks ran free, and the people of San Miguel began to remember what it meant to be a community. The Boone Ranch thrived. The cattle grew fat and healthy. Henry was welcomed back to school, not as an outcast, but as a hero. He walked with a newfound confidence, a boy who knew his own worth, and the house, once so silent, was now filled with life. Abby's laughter echoed in the kitchen. The sound of Henry reading aloud filled the evenings, and Louisa's quiet contentment was a steady, comforting presence. One crisp autumn evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sun set the mountains ablaze, Louis took Abby's hand. "Abby Yoder," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "when I spoke for you at the courthouse, it was a marriage of convenience, a desperate act by a desperate man." He squeezed her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm asking you now, in front of our son, if you'll do me the honor of being my wife for real, in every way, a marriage of the heart." Tears of joy streamed down Abby's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Oh, yes." Henry let out a whoop from his spot on the steps. "It's about time," he cheered, his grin as wide as the Colorado sky. They were a family forged in fire, their bonds tempered by adversity into something stronger than steel. A testament to the truth that even in the dust of cruelty, with a little bit of faith and a whole lot of courage, love can find a way to grow. Thank you for being part of this story. Courage, faith, and standing up for what's right are values that connect us all. If these are the stories that speak to your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what we share here is more than just tales. It's a reminder of the best parts of who we can be. And I can't wait to see you on the next one.